Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for another episode of the Daily BizLink. Stacie, Mallen is back. And as we continue to celebrate May as Mental Health Month, we are breaking down the stigma of mental health and helping you to get a head start by changing the language that you use. So Stacie, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you for supporting my passion around this. Not just this month, but, we're going to be focused a long time to come. As we started looking at the data around mental health, there's really a challenge around access to care. But what I kind of recognized is access to care has two components. One is literal access to counseling services and caregivers and that piece. But I believe the biggest access to care that we have in this country and probably globally is the stigma associated with mental health. So we started to ask ourselves, and it's a question that we're going to be asking on the podcast of some experts that are going to be coming on, is, so what can I do? And I think about, as a parent, as a leader, as a friend, like, what are the things that I can do? Because many times you feel helpless in trying to help some navigate that space. And the reality is there's a lot more people in your life that are probably having these challenges that are not talking about it. So how do we get people to talk about it so we can get people the help that they need? And so language is so important. And I worked in the space of mental health several years ago, a startup that we were growing in the mental health space. And, one of the things that I became aware of is we use language in life like, oh, that's crazy, or, derogatory terms. So that's step number one for me. Like, just be aware of your own language. Some people say, oh, that's just my OCD when they're talking about, them being very specific about things. So number one is awareness of the language that you utilize on a day-to-day basis. And I will say sometimes, oh, that's my challenge with ADHD. Now, I'm being serious. That is actually my challenge with ADHD. But a lot of people say that, and they mean that they are distracted, right? So language is important. The second is knowing how to have conversations around mental health. And this takes practice. Nobody expects you to be perfect. The first and the foremost one that I would say, if after you think about the derogatory words, is the term committed suicide. And I don't know if anybody's talked about this with you, but it's really died by suicide. Committing suicide is actually putting the onus on the individual versus died by suicide. It's such a subtle difference, but this is, again, the stigma that we have around mental health. Instead of saying somebody's an addict or they're addicted, it's they have an alcohol or drug problem or challenge, or they're struggling with alcohol and drugs. And then instead of saying someone's mentally ill, someone has a mental illness. And again, the subtlety is, putting a label on someone that you're mentally ill. I wouldn't say to you, Lindsay, you're broken armed, right? I'm not defining you by your broken arm. I'm saying, oh, you have a broken arm and you're working around those challenges to get better. So I think the context that was helpful for me in that space, in this space in general, is how do you talk about physical ailments versus mental challenges that people are having? So that's where I sort of try to walk the line or do my best, and I'm not perfect either.
I mean, I know for me, I've even learned a couple of tips just from this conversation, just having that additional layer of heightened awareness about how we are talking about it and talking to ourselves, I think will go a long way. So Stacie, I appreciate you offering some really practical tips that individuals can look to implement immediately. So as we look to wrap up today's conversation, I know you offered some great tips that they can automatically implement, but is there anything else that you'd like to leave our audience with?
Probably the most important thing is leading with your heart. And I know that's things that people say all the time, but mental illness and addiction are hard for people to support. Sometimes in a selfish way, we want to say that's ugly or hard or painful or uncomfortable. So can you put that in a box and like set that over there? Because I don't want to deal with it. Same thing with grief. People deal with grief you're at a funeral, you can sort of deal with it in the container. But outside of that, people struggle to support people in grief. So I just think it's something additional to think about when someone's having a challenge. How can you show up for people? Again, if somebody had surgery and they were, laying in a hospital room, would you ask them to set that aside and not have that be relevant to your life or impact your life? And the reality is that for most people, this feels invisible, but to the person suffering, it is not. So I think that's just again, a frame of reference and a mindset that I think we need to shift into.
Stacie, I appreciate you taking the time to join us and for continuing the conversation as it relates to Mental Health Month. So Stacie, thanks again.
Thank you.